Hello everyone, today we introduce very briefly the topic of the Slavic migrations to the Balkans. I made several videos, probably some of which have brought you here because of the algorithm, as I see, about, let's say, the migration era first of all, but also migration era in, let's say, in the Balkans, in fact, in Eastern and Central Europe. And we talked about the Slavs extensively. We read the Strategicon and Leo the Wise on the Slavic warfare in early medieval times, from the Byzantine perspective. We still have a lot really to say, especially about that. We temporarily stopped the military, specifically military based contact, but we will resume it soon at some point. And I realized that I never made a specific video about properly the Slavic migrations and the ones essentially in the south of Europe. I'm making this really basic chapters now to provide the channel with further algorithmic base, and so chances are that we will be covering in a sort of encyclopedical fashion these topics in old times and spaces, at least as far as medieval Europe is concerned, but we can easily extend that to especially other places. So this topic is immense for many reasons that are not just scientific in nature, but that intertwine unavoidably, however, in fact, with politics, with national identity, a lot of things that, the Balkan Peninsula, think about the concept of Balkanization, has, let's say, a harsh history of, and that, however, it's important to kind of assess, like, limpidly, objectively as much as we can. As you know, I'm no expert specifically about Balkan, nor Balkan or Slavic history, but I've always been interested in the region for many reasons. Now I won't digress on, and so this is also the chance for me to clear my thoughts, as some things are kind of there, but until you style them out and you articulate them, you may miss some important pictures and dimensions. Naturally, we made lots of videos also about the Byzantine Empire and the Balkan frontier as a whole, or the frontiers altogether. You know that the same term Balkans is susceptible geographically to different interpretations, right? Some look at the Sava or the Danube line down to not include Greece in that. Some include even Anatolia in the Balkans. And there is a history there that in fact is interesting. For example, the Slavs of Anatolia, the bridge of the straits that always, historically, I think since about the Thracians, the Paphlagonians, etc., that were kind of straddling across the straits, and the same Byzantine history with its deportations of people, the same as would happen also later with the Ottoman Empire, had this kind of blending capacity. And the history of the Byzantine Empire especially is deeply connected, as you know, to the Balkan frontier, that in many ways remain perhaps continuously the most important, right? The empire kind of maintained control in different eras, different times, but say, if anything, not just because Constantinople is in Europe and the Balkans is just the interland, right? Starting from there. And the Byzantines knew how concrete this was. Think about the first Bulgarian Empire, it was just next door, etc. But let's say there was a continuity since Roman times, since the Roman conquests during the 1st century BC in the Balkans, that were consolidated further eventually in the following centuries, also with the conquest of Dacia, etc., of the control of the Danubian frontier that had always been kind of, in fact, even for the same Roman Empire, the most troubled, and one from which, in fact, most peoples would eventually break into the empire, at least, especially the most threatening. The Goths, the ones that had an important political compaction. And there is a continuity with this also in Slavic times, because if you think about the Anta in today's southwestern Ukraine fundamentally, and the proximity, they are the same migration routes, that the same locations where the Goths had been settled, and eventually the Rus would develop, and this even important maritime capacity would come to threaten Constantinople, and not just in fact from land, is a story that is often not told, because historiographically we know very few about these areas. In general, the Balkans are much less documented than the rest of Europe, for reasons that have to do essentially with this, importantly, with this frontier dimension of the region, that in a sense didn't provide the local polities with the say that protracted stability that could consolidate permanent statal systems that in a way or another crumbled, because the Bulgarian Empire was destroyed by the Byzantines, and the Serbian one was destroyed by the Ottomans, etc. And so it's an area that couldn't sedimentate, even just documentarily, other, say, as much as the statal process would do in Western Europe. It was also, in fact, for many during the modern age under the Ottomans, that surely were something different from even just other empires existing in Europe. Archaeology is crucial, right? And ethnic issues as well are based on some kind of interest on really question marks about even the origins of some peoples. We made videos, for example, about the origins of the Romanians. We talk about the Wallachians, the important migrations within the same Balkans and their valleys, the Transhumans, etc. And so it's an area all to discover. Even the historiography of these countries today is really doing a lot to, in fact, spread more awareness, and something that these countries could do just very late compared to other areas of Europe. So it takes time, it takes effort, it takes also the development of important academic cultures that can be, can assess ever more objectively the history of these countries, but also many things simply cannot be known, again, because we have to rely on, at least on methods such as by analogy, for example, that are not, of course, they're risky in a way, but that's the only thing we have. And after all, I think that the picture is comprehensively more, it makes more sense than it's commonly thought in general, and just maybe some strictly local issues are more problematic. In any case, the Slavic migrations to the Balkans took place essentially since the mid 6th century and the first decades of the 7th. Naturally, here we're not talking about the ethnic origin of the Slavs. Maybe we will make a video about that and say something actually now at the end of this one as well. But the mechanisms that triggered the expansion of these peoples, the settlement of these peoples, especially, are something that dates far more back in time than one would actually think, because also those areas, in fact, were not documented, right? Largely for a late antiquity and great part of the early Middle Ages, we fundamentally rely on just the Byzantine raider as far as the Slavs in Eastern Europe are concerned. That is to say, yes, we know there were important cultures in Central Eastern Europe that, for example, material ones that we can archaeologically assess, and these do overlap objectively with the indications that are provided by documentary sources. But again, without documentary sources, archaeological data doesn't really have a tag most of the times, especially when material culture was, after all, very homogeneous and easily shareable also with other peoples. Also, the times are quite brutal and primitive. Early medieval Europe was very poor materially, and especially the areas, in fact, of Central Europe, the Balkans, as you know, had undergone some areas probably had never seen what we call a civilization by those time standards, but also, especially along the Danubian frontier, there had been an important decline of the previous, of the previous statal structure that had existed in Roman times. So, as we will see, the Slavs actually fit exactly this area. They expanded exactly in those areas that had been more depopulated, which also kind of brought a greater impact, ethnically speaking, in relative terms, right, by different degrees, of course, depending on the places. There is also an enormous debate, which is more ideological than historiographical in a way, that for this reason is of relative importance. But let's say the way the Slavs have been pictured by mostly the countries that in fact began to talk about these things essentially during the socialist era, that had to stress the Stalinian ideal of, at least the quite instrumental use of pan-Slavism to the ends, in that case of Soviet actually Russian imperialism, that had to provide this flat idea of the Slavs, right? Kind of dramatically unstratified people that lived in this kind of sort of socialistic agricultural utopia that expanded with the force of work in the fields and not with war, and that didn't have much hierarchies, because those were seen, of course, in socialistic as as anything human in civilization, in an anti-communistic view, let's say, and I guess collectivism, etc. And so this view has generated, let's say, a bias towards what the nature properly of the Slavs per se, by probably overlooking the degree, in fact, of political cohesion that certain groups had at this time, and how, let's say, they interacted, especially with the greatest powers that were still forming, in fact, at the time. We will see especially the relation with the Outer Khaganate, and more in general also with other groups, even the Huns before, for which they are called historiographically shepherds of peoples, because these were essentially nomadic confederacies that ruled in a radically brutal fashion, with an incredible level of autocracy and intense kind of ideologization in the idea of rule and of universal power, etc., that would literally hurt this other sedentary, say at least semi-nomadic by a certain standard, given that here we're talking about migrations, peoples, but still more sedentary peoples in Europe that didn't have the same level of political and military development, because the methods of still is made of accept this groups very cohese, at least for the goal of seizing new lands, fresh pastures, read the Carpathian Basin, the Pannonian Plain, where in fact the Huns, the Avars, the Magyars would settle, and in fact hurting these other peoples in order to populate these lands, to work for them in a sort of servile relation, and with the conquerors, that therefore denies a sort of Slavic protagonism or power or capacity in the process. And this thing has been importantly revisited, not much in fact because we think that the Slavs had dramatic political cohesion. As a matter of fact, great part of the same Slavic character of the Slavic migration shows otherwise. But still, and this is according to me the most overlooked thing, that the degree of commixtion of let's say of this nomadic and Slavic elites in the creation also of the same Slavic polities is crucial, right, and not stressed enough, right? These invaders were not just Turks or Ugra-Finns. There were also a lot of Iranians, right? A lot of Indo-Europeans that had been overwhelmed by this time, mostly by the Turks in the steppe, but still were there, they weren't exterminated, and then they brought to some kind of, in fact, reinjection, as we know, also of chivalric and, old military traditional view of religion in the same Europe, right, seeding properly that base for of chivalry and of the mounted and heavily armored ruling elite of coming from the sky, literally over these chthonic populations of Europe that had been habituated at that point to be under, right, as subjects of an empire rather than active citizens like at time or even as tribesmen before. And this is evident, if anything, in realities like, I don't know, Bulgaria, that even survives politically in, its legacy to this day as the modern country in fact, of a country that bears the name essentially of a Turkic people that surely had important Indo-European elements within it, but that essentially is a Slavic country because the majority of the people there were Slav. The Bulgars essentially became Bulgarians because they were absorbed by the majority. And this happened probably with lots of other groups that managed, in fact, to, again, command the migrations in virtue of their own quite militarized nature initially and hierarchical character, but that eventually kind of identified with the same group, dependently from the ethnic origin of the local peoples. And this is interesting because surely there were groups that were quite just directly stemming, even we see it geographically from areas that we realize were probably just Slavic or Slavicized at least, because there is all the problem of the Thraco-Illyrians that fundamentally had inhabited the Balkans traditionally, and that had been eventually Hellenized or Romanized, and that probably also underwent some great stress, destruction, if not exterminations, migrations, deportations, etc. in the process, and also kind of blended with the Slavs. But it's true that the Slavic migration does take the form of a sort of tide, right, of human tide. Actually, the Slavs do not seem even to have been, particularly many, right? It's just that they came at the end, properly, of the migration era, at least within the same, the group of same European peoples, to populate areas that, as we were saying before, had, in fact, remained kind of uninhabited, largely, at least had declined importantly, where literally other peoples that had inhabited there had moved elsewhere, right? When the Germans basically stopped to move, the Slavs come in. And the Balkans are a key here to read the whole thing, because as we were saying before, the most important tribal groups that had eventually also had a great success within the same lands of the Roman Empire, namely the Goths, right? First, what we call as the Visigoths, and eventually the Ostrogoths, had dwelt in the Balkans, right? So in the same areas that eventually would be refilled by the Slavs demographically. And so there is a sort of substitution, a kind of interlocking mechanism on the base of the available land. Right, and of course the fact that the Slavs seized eventually some of the least developed areas of the, at least in part, we can call it Mediterranean world, but it's not entirely correct, because in fact, from the Danubian, on the side of the Danubian watershed, that's basically Central Europe, right? But of course they pushed according to Adriatic, the Aegean, the Black Sea. Some settled in Anatolia, even some took boats, arrived up to North Africa. We have evidence of this. Also, an underestimated aspect is, of course, and I didn't finish the phrase before, is that what we call as Slavs or Proto-Slavs surely migrated in important number, right, interspersed, especially among the Germanic peoples, quite early on, right, and in small groups, right, and there is no reason to believe that fundamentally they wouldn't have a very similar lifestyle to the same Germans originally, especially in this idea of, this war bands, of this sacred brotherhoods of warriors that would roam the entire world, literally, of the time, in search of glory, the Slava, in fact. And in this kind of military fashion, after all, the lifestyle was pretty similar. And there is also in Slavic military culture probably an element of equestrian culture that we tend to underestimate a little bit, maybe because of some bias of the sources, right? But this is at least more evident, however, in Eastern Europe for obvious reasons, right? They were at greater contact with the nomads of the steppes. They dwelt fundamentally in the same steppe. But this is the point, right? But some of the essentially original lands of the Slavs at the core were today's southeastern Poland and Ukraine, right? So those are areas that historically maintained a very important cavalry bias, right? And it would be interesting to appreciate more kind of how this came to be chronologically, for which I made also some videos, in fact, about Slavic warfare to try to define better. Also, there is an historiographical debate on, and you see, the Slavs here changed really the ethnic face of the Balkans and other areas they settled, because some were German historically. I mean, think about in the west they arrived up to the Elbe River, right? The Germans historically stretched way more far than that. They arrived at the Vistula, etc. So they really refilled the gaps that had been left empty in many ways, and Slavicized the countries in the process. They brought to population change, mixing and language shift to and from Slavic. And there is a great historiographical debate on naturally why these migrations happened, right? Some say, there is kind of the usual thing that you've seen in the last generations as the main thing. It was a climate change. This was the late antique little ice age from around say the first half of the 6th and the second half of the 7th century. Maybe there was a need of new land to survive, to strive. It's possible, it's a factor, but let's not underestimate other issues that are surely all intertwined. Many say it's the plague of Justinian, it's the instability that the same system brought, right? Some actually read it mostly in the sense that those areas of the Balkans were underpopulated because of the plague, and these people simply moved in. It's a possible explanation as well as yet another factor. The plague would probably travel fast, and so probably it spread less in the north of Europe, paradoxically, if anything, for lesser demographic density and exchanges, communications, than in the south, where the Mediterranean was very crowded. The still late antiquity was prosperous, in fact, up to the plague that seemed to have caused, as a big crack of the same late antique system structurally. There is also the political issue there. The Byzantine Empire, that is probably the single most overlooked historiographically in general, because we're not habituated to reason in ideal terms, but the fact that the Byzantine Empire was constantly, almost, and by threat always, for sure, involved in the wars against the Sasanian Empire and the same Avar Khaganate, so in the same Balkans, brought surely these people to think, in a way or another, that they could make number, and pressure this system, right? We underestimate, I think, how much then in this case, I think it was mostly probably a migrational problem. In the West, it was different, because in the West it was a migrational problem, let's say from at least Central Europe to the West, and then the settlement happened because the Western Roman Empire evaporated. It wasn't much of an actual push, right? It was a much greater coexistence, after all, between Latins and Germans. When it came to the Balkans, you realize that the resistance of the empire brought to a greater political and ideological polarization. It was embodied by, in fact, powers of universal ambitions, like, in fact, the same Constantinople, but also the Avar Khaganate, that the Slavs perhaps saw also as that alternative that would back to the Romans. This is exemplified, for example, by the backbone of the Avar Khaganate, properly consisting, from a military point of view, of Slavic tribes that were mobilized, as it happened at the siege of Constantinople in the summer of 626, when it was one of the many sieges that eventually the city withstood, especially thanks to its massive infrastructure. Not mostly, probably, but that was something that especially these peoples, like the Avars, habituated to steppes settlements, didn't quite have the even though the Avars were actually capable, in obsidianly speaking. They brought the Chinese trebuchet, that they changed an important build things technologically. They were very advanced, right? In fact, the Byzantines, famously enough, in the Strategicon said that they were the most powerful of the barbarians, probably from even, could say, anachronistically a doctrinal point of view. And it's evident that in the process, Constantinople was losing ground in a way that would be ever more evident kind of medieval times, because until the Roman Empire existed more or less along the pattern of antiquity, you do have pretty massive stretches of land that the Romans, especially from the Romano-Italic background, had been used to colonize territory, to absorb the rest of the population and to Romanize them, right? This is something that the Byzantines, that had a greater Hellenic bias, didn't quite conceive in the same way, because their mindset was more, say, closed in some fashion around the older coastal, in fact, urban environment that kind of considered the hinterland, the countryside, as literally another world, and it was in many ways. We've seen it in different videos, and it's an important key to realize how also strictly oligarchic and properly imperial in nature, and how proud of its own cultural uniqueness, even at the price of xenophobia, and at some point even the same crystallization of the initially very good capacities, especially in this period, of understanding other peoples ethnographically, anthropologically, etc. The Byzantine Empire really had. This divide is interesting because you can find it in the same Balkans. I mean, the Danubian area was kind of more Romanized, right? The Romans eventually, probably, but still the same Romanian people stem from today, was these populations that you find even in Slavic languages, like in Serbian and Croatian. There is a lot of, Romance loans, right? Whereas from the Mediterranean side, you have, of course, the Greek influence that in fact increased, and as you see by the even just the ever less impacting presence, probably of Slavic ethnic element up to the south, even though the Slavs came to essentially to occupy even the Peloponnese, where it seems that a relevant Slavic ethnic legacy has remained. I mean, not huge, but in fact that's the least, and some of the area that was the least Slavicized. We were talking up to maybe something like 14% at the most, ethnic descent. So it's and those were kind of populated areas, right? They were the Mediterranean core-land, heartland, right? So in a way, the Central European Danubian side of the story would always be pretty problematic for the Byzantines to recover. As you know, the empire in medieval times re-expanded after the early medieval crisis, coming to encompass, in fact, sometimes up to far in the northwest of the Balkans, up to Croatia, right? But it was very difficult to maintain a stable control in the area that would historically become a frontier, because the same empire at that point didn't really believe in permanent, as stationing of field armies on the frontier. Everything was kind of all more in depth and entrusted, in fact, to these strongholds, and the Balkans were the ideal for that, because as you know, they are a nightmarish ground for any army. As I often say, you don't really know between the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian one, and the Balkan one, which is the worst ground for any army historically in history, as even kind of recent events in the last centuries really proved on many occasions. And so this would be evident, in fact, even later on for the Ottomans, that some parts of the Balkan hinterland were, yes, namely under the empire, but they weren't quite occupied or controlled. I mean, think about Montenegro. That was an area where, there was some Ottoman garrison here and there, but fundamentally in the valleys, in other, there were areas that were kind of unreachable, that were just scratched by kind of external influence. And this character was, so it was like a huge stripe, right, of land, especially south of, has actually straddling the Danube Valley, but mostly in the south, because again, the Byzantines mostly controlled the coast of their center of power. So even the immediate hinterland sometimes was something really different. Was hundreds of kilometers deep and in terrifying ground of mountains, Balkan is actually a Turkish loan word that means mountain itself, in fact forests. Also pretty harsh weather there in winter, etc. And in fact a logistical nightmare, right, for any army that has to make permanent conquests. So this allowed, in a sense, whoever ruled the Carpathian Basin and Constantinople respectively to, let's say, maintain this kind of enormous proxy buffer area that doesn't matter how deep the enemy would raid, it would quite difficultly reach the other side and cause substantial damage to the let's say, the hinterland infrastructure of the area. So this is the areas where the Slavs dwelled, right, which conferred them, and again, we've seen it in the strategic, on some incredibly fierce, warlike, and almost, this is characteristic of the Slavs historically, fanatic defenders character, right? They were capable, especially at this time. Just imagine having moved just from Central Europe, Eastern Europe, settling these areas. These peoples were capable of withdrawing. They would occupy the local cities, centers. These were urbanized areas. Doesn't matter how, say, declining they were, how degraded they were. But in case of a murder, they would just be able to abandon the main centers to refuge themselves in the swamps, in the forests, in this hill forts overloaded with stones to throw against the soldiers, etc. That were too costly for even a hell of a permanent professional military just to storm. And so this was always the story, as it happened in other areas, right? The least developed areas, they can't be tamed. These peoples took refuge in the mountains. Think about just the settlement historically of the Serbs, etc. They were in the mountains, not in the valleys most. And they would descend regularly for raiding, but coming back, as we've studied this Clausewitz, this means, of course, that the strategic upper hand is for who lives in the valley, right? Because they have more resources, they can control them better, they're connected more to the rest of the world. But there were always a permanent thorn in the side with guerrilla, with raids. In fact, part of the Strategicon deals with this quick and also with this kind of mutuation of the same Slavic tactics by a certain degree to try to block immediately the retreat of these peoples who were habituated. They had literally their settlements disposed in a way that would favor their retreat into some other impregnable areas, and in order to try to essentially subjugate them more effectively, or even deporting, exterminating them in some way. And so the hardcore resilience of these peoples is extraordinary, and they were extremely clever. If you watch the video about Slavic warfare I made, you understand how clever these peoples really were with a very meager resources that they had, and that's where ingenuity is really solicited. Now, these times were, as you know, exhausting for everybody. In the process, the entire continent, or Eurasia, if you want, was contracting brutally from an economical and demographic point of view. So at a certain point, this favored naturally on the longer period the autonomization, say the consolidation of some of these even modest powers. After all, they were initially just clans. Very gradually, we made a video about the Duchy of Croatia just the other day, just kind of starting to elect somebody who had to hegemonize the control in a sort of ducal, princely, eventually monarchic fashion. That are also the base of some, in fact, the modern Balkan identities. And there is a divide, importantly enough, between, let's say, the western area, that as we will see properly Constantinople dealt with strategically in a different way, and the eastern one is the lower, like Thrace, you would call that, because they are, even as you understand, geographically different. The first are more mountains, the others is more flat land and marshy areas. And the Byzantines could not really wage war on two fronts at the same time, right? Not just with the Persians or the Avars, etc., but also in the same Balkans, because simply the access ways, the orography obliged them to distance too much the armies, to just were obliged to follow certain valleys and paths. And so these powers developed differently, right, with some Sclavinians that consolidated more, in the West, as smaller autonomous powers that, however, would still kind of intermittently fall under the Byzantine or whoever was ruling in the Hungarian plain control. And the Bulgar Khaganate, that differently from the other one, would be effectively Slavicized and would emerge actually as a hell of a state that hadn't been destroyed by Constantinople, would probably hegemonize the Balkans, as it was historically controlling the in fact the eastern part, but also successfully subjugating at some point, still in a decentralized fashion, but still the Serbs, the Croats. In the late Middle Ages, the other way around would go on, I guess. So especially the Serbian power would, without the Ottomans, were probably hegemonized the Balkans. So the Slavs were essentially, that settled in the Balkans, were divided in two groups, the Ante and the Sclaveni. These were loose, could call them national in the Latin sense groups, that were fragmented, of course, in other tribes and clans, and smaller groups of Slavs, as we were saying before, participated since the end of the 5th century in the campaigns of the Huns and the Germanic tribes to the raids in the Roman Empire. Right, we know that even some Germanic migrations, such as the one of the Ostrogoths or the Longobards, had Slavic elements within them. There's archaeological traits, in graves, like in Longobard graves in Italy, of people that have a striking similarity genetically to the ones of Polish people today. So this contact in Central Europe had always been important, right? And so the Slavs had, or the Proto-Slavs, we're going to call them, were always kind of around, probably more than we think. They had also an important degree of mix with the Baltic peoples as well, that seemed to have, in fact, some important connections, especially with the Croats, with the Serbs, because these had first migrated still in the realm of Central Europe and more in the north, and probably they had some greater contact with them eventually when some of them eventually descended in the Balkans, settling across the region of the Dinaric Alps. In any case, the first sure Slavic raids to be dated historically are in the early 6th century. This happened during the reign of Emperor Justin I, so ruling between 518 and 527. And interestingly enough, they are connected to the revolt of Vitalian, that was a general of the Roman Empire and native of the province of Mysia in the Nordic Balkans. He was probably of mixed, as it was typical at the time, of Roman and Gothic or Scythian or whatever, say, barbarian group. That in this sense seems to have made leverage on, in fact, the power of some Slavic elements further north to pressure in Thrace, right? The same Constantinople, right? Thrace, where he had become a senior commander. Vitalian threatened Constantinople. wasn't even punished. At the end of the day, he would even be forgiven. But let's say this mechanism is quite interesting because it already shows that this continental element, that again, the empire was not a 19th century nation state, right? The empire was factually the power that the Romans exercised over a virtually infinite area as an ecumenic empire. So every people at the time fundamentally gravitated around Rome in Western Eurasia, where in another North Africa, and these peoples were, let's say, participating to the great struggle of resistance / participation in the imperium. That was the universal religious military value of tradition for everybody, right? So very complex relations. Now, I will not digress on my usual thing about the celestial glory and all this stuff, but let's say it's meaningful that the Slavs were already participating into this pressure against Constantinople under the same Roman general, after all. Procopius records that in 518 a large army of the Ante, quote, would dwell close to the Sclaveni, crossed the Danube River into the Roman territory. So we're talking about the Istra, in fact, the mouth of the Danube, right, that on the Black Sea. Also, this Ante continued with ever faster and stronger incursion at the time of Justinian the First, 527-565. So much that Procopius records that the whole Illyricum and Thrace, so basically the entire Balkans, were almost every year pillaged by what he called the Huns that were still around by the time. Now, they didn't die out with Attila, by the way, but surely they were just a group at that point of the others. The Sclaveni, the Ante, which made enormous damage, especially to the natives or the local Roman subjects, making the region into, quote, a Scythian desert. This is interesting because it shows, even under Justinian I, so basically one of the moments of greatest power of the Roman Empire, that so literally the reconquest of the West, one of a massive effort everywhere, a moment of great prosperity, development, internal stability, at least until, let's say, the plague and other events. Yes, the world could be stable, for the relative terms of the time. The Balkans could already be permeated by people like the Ante and the same Sclaveni and the Huns, so these other Turkic groups, that would literally exploiting there, in fact, a weakness of the northern frontier of the empire, raiding, so at this time not really settling, so we're still in a mindset that probably, you see, these peoples were faring, when we think about the decline of the Roman Empire, it's not that other peoples were gaining the upper hand, they were all decaying pretty badly from a demographic and economical point of view. So raiding for them in this case would have been the better way to accumulate wealth, and only later on they would properly move in to seize the lands, because at this point, evidently, yes, the Roman frontiers could be permeated, but still, if they had settled there, probably they would have been crushed by some Roman army, right? So the thing was, just as always, a kind of a tit for tat, usually, or more than actually these peoples having the upper hand in that specific theater. But it's relevant again how they still lived of a lifestyle that was not ready to assimilation in a way, and they had some, probably in this sense, also some degree of hierarchy, also of role models, such as the ones of the steppes. In fact, here the name of the Huns is probably not anecdotal. That had encompassed a bit in the previous centuries. In fact, all those peoples, this is especially evident among the Germans. We have the comparison between those that were under the Romans and those who were under the Huns. They had different behaviors, they had different models, and the ones that were under the Huns, frankly, they had more ferocious ones and more kind of savage, but still also kind of military effective, as much as also the Roman one could be, but in different ways. And at that time, the Danubian limes was poorly defended, right? The problem of the empire was always finding the resources to have essentially a field army to send for a grand campaign, whereas the local communities were expected as obvious, as sort of militias. Not always, sometimes they were properly full professionals. This is, in fact, not properly understood of the Limitani very often. But to rely on local resources to defend in this case, the Danube line, it was still the thing, where the Romans had retreated since the time of Aurelian, by abandoning Dacia, by the way, to these people. And we made a video about that, right, about Trans-Danubian Dacia, and incidentally, in that case, the origin of the Romanian people. And since this, especially the Ante, seem to have been some importantly developed from a political point of view for Slavic standards, Justinian I decided to make an alliance with them to essentially contain them, to give them probably some better option, right? This is again essentially in today's Ukraine, and later on would have been the Rus, and so they had this conflictual relations with the empire, but still kind of eventually agreeing for kind of a cooperation, trade and alliance, and the stability of the region. So in a process of what seemed promising, we want to say better, for establishing kind of sort of control on the area. Consider that the Byzantines were at that point still importantly involved in the Balkans as far as concerned, especially the support of respectively the Longobards or the Gepids that were instead settled in the western part, and that according on who became, on the balance of power, two people supporting, the weaker one to kind of counterbalance the other. Eventually, the Longobards migrated in Italy, while the Gepids were destroyed essentially by the Avars, and that's where the Slavs also came into play, and especially, in fact, the Sclaveni in the Western Balkans. And so when Justinian secured an alliance with the Ante, in fact, the majority of the Slavic incursions arrived within the imperial boundary, arrived from the so-called Podunavlje area. That is a Serbo-Croatian term used to define, actually, I think if I'm not wrong, it literally means the entire course of the Danube, that at least as far as they were concerned in their location. And so in this case, in the western part of the empire, that was in fact very, especially with the destruction of the Gepid kingdom. We made a video about the Gepids at the hands of the Avars. Was, a very prized and strategic area to control, right? Various rivers intersection, there are several rivers flowing the Danube there. There were important fortresses and infrastructures, etc. So whoever controlled the area kind of had the upper hand on the frontier, right? That's how it was. And the Avars, as we've seen, came also with the Slavs. And the Avars, by the way, at this time weren't the steamrolling military machine that will be known, for example, at the time, 1 century later, at the time of the siege of Constantinople of 626, because they were all still divided in clans. Eventually they would reunite properly in the Khaganate, but and this probably favored, in fact, the Slavic spread also in a kind of a controlled way, and sometimes even in an autonomous fashion. And in fact, as it's known for the settlement of the Serbs and the Croats at the time of Heraclius, 1 century later, the Slavic incursions in the area were also often connected to the periodical instability of, in that case, of the Avar Khaganate, right, as all powers more or less contracted, and the entire history of these powers ever, including the Byzantine Empire, there is some internal revolt, mess, so the enemies raid the frontiers, then somebody arrives as a stronger ruler, reconsolidates the frontier, back and forth, and so every time it was an internal divide, or some civil war, whatever, between the clans in the Pannonian Plain, the Slavs would flow, exploiting our weakness, let's say, and kind of also cooperating with the empire, in fact, in an anti-Avar fashion, or simply, it was rather the Romans who were giving formal green light to this thing to happen, even though they couldn't really stop it, and still the Slavs would settle within their own boundaries. This is interesting because if you look historically on the map on the settlement of the Slavic peoples all around the Carpathian Basin, you realize that of course the same Carpathian Basin at some point in the Pannonian Plain were Slavicized, right? Especially in moments that, between the major migrations of this, in fact, the Avars, the Magyars, etc. But that eventually the Slavic nature would be retained around that, right? Around in the mountains, especially. We've seen this when we made videos still about high medieval Hungary, that was kind of still more like an empire than a kingdom, because it controlled these surrounding Slavic areas that also received different influxes materially, right? I don't know, the Slovakians in the north would have more like a Frankish looking military culture. The Serbs in the south were something kind of more Byzantine, if not even Russian, by some Black Sea influence across the course of the Danube. Whereas the kind of ethnic character of the steppe would be maintained usually in the Pannonian, in the Hungarian heartland at that point. So different distance in space doesn't necessarily mean more or less similarity, right? It really depends. Some environments can be very close, as we've seen just with Constantinople and the hinterland, and being still very different culturally. And this has to do naturally also with the nature of the terrain, the type of land exploitation, etc. And in spite, in fact, of these incursions in the Western Balkans, still by the beginning by the mid-6th century, a peaceful and permanent Slavic settlement on Byzantine territory began, right? And after all, the Byzantines were they didn't really care about who their subjects were, right? Again, there wasn't much of a difference. What these powers feared was mostly the political compaction of these people under some sort of confederacies that could, by unity of command, wage important military operations, threatening the same stability of the empire in a consistent fashion. But as long as these peoples were kind of more tame, or at least didn't have enough political cohesion to mount up major military threats, etc., they would actually work just like anybody else, like farmers, essentially. So as manpower, labor force, because of course settling also in the Roman lands, they would become, by cultural osmosis, sooner or later Roman, right? And still, I don't know, when a Roman army arrived in these lands and kind of revived partially the local government with local officials, etc., it was a pretty militarized situation. They would just levy some of the local, able-bodied males to provide for some militia service, town watch, all these things, and some auxiliary forces in common. In fact, I made a video about the early medieval kind of Byzantine auxiliaries, including in fact some of the Slavs in that instance. And of course, as always, these auxiliaries were, in terms of military culture, always kind of the enemies and the mercenaries still of the empire. So the empire was quite skilled at this point at kind of coping really with every kind of threat. This is kind of the Byzantine maintained long run, because they had actually massive amount of these peoples within their own army, right? It was the kind of the permanent field army that was maintained also with important infrastructures and depots, etc., in the Mediterranean heartland. And then you had all these other peoples that sometimes simply just were seeking for a job as mercenaries, and they would be paid, would be attracted. There was lots of foreigners in Constantinople all the time, and so it was surrounded by lots of different peoples in the first place. So the Byzantines were never running short out, and also because, again, they had the gold, they had the wealth, right? So this other continental peoples didn't really have much, so they were very easy to attract in great numbers. But the more that was true, and say the cheaper also they were. But again, that is also a matter of political and social segmentation, right? And also the elites could be co-opted, as it would happen often in this process of Urbanization at court at Constantinople. Was very famous. It happened with lots of peoples. So the arrival of the Pannonian Avars, as we've seen, changed importantly the game, because first of all they fought against the Ante, So that kind of stability in the Ukraine area that had been somewhat secured diplomatically by Constantinople was disrupted, and the Avars got even more powerful because they began to not just to subjugate but to deportate with them masses of both the Ante and the Sclave. And again, so these peoples had been used in general to the instability of the region, and it was not really this huge problem to move technically. They lived like that, but these clans were usually just autonomous, logistically speaking. They found food on their own, they were able to survive in the wilderness and all this stuff. But also the opportunity, in fact, of some, political consolidation in the area was annihilated, and so these clans were on the move under the Avars. So after the death of Justinian I, the new Roman Emperor Justin II, 565-574, triggered essentially a century-long war period by stopping to pay subsidies to the Avars, as they had done up to that point, to keep them at bay, which was the normal currency of diplomacy at the time, tributes fundamentally, because they felt confident enough to cope with them. But the empire, as we were saying before, had lots of problems at the same time. So, for example, the wars of 572 and 591, and the 602 and 628 with the Persians in the east, which were exploited by the Avars and the Slavs to make devastating intrusions in different areas, right? Not just in the empire. For example, the Avars launched some raids in Merovingian Germany, in Longobard, northern Italy, but they arrived also up to southern Greece, right? Again, there was no real barrier, right? There was not like a major lock of the valley, something continuous that could effectively prevent these peoples to raid unopposed. I mean, even if there were infrastructures, etc., those are null if there's nobody to like this as an overwhelming force impressed locally on just militia forces that will simply melt away or even join the raiders just to raid together with them, as it would happen. So this, again, if you look at the military history of the Balkans throughout all the Middle Ages, it's always like that, right? We had the upper end could come to raid all across the thing. It's just they couldn't control most of it. So it was this retaliatory tit-for-tat strategies that mostly worked, again, because settling in the interland to maintain a stable military presence was complicated, to say the least. And it is in this process, really, so by the 7th century, that the Slavs settle in all of the Balkans and the Peloponnese, right? So much that Emperor Maurice, that is the same ruler in whose court, milieu entourage, in fact, the Pseudo Maurice, the Strategicon, was written, waged an important set, in fact, campaigns in the same Balkans between 582 and 602, which, however, did not prevent the Slavs from taking key cities like Sirmium, Viminatum, those were especially the important ones, and the Danubian watershed, and Thessalonica, actually on the Mediterranean, that was practically to become basically the only truly important city after Constantinople in the empire. Also, after Maurice's death, probably the Roman rule on the Balkans evaporated. Once again, that intermittent dynamic I was saying before. The Slavs in this process destroyed important centers like Justiniana Prima, and that would be near modern Lebane in the Leskovac region, southern Serbia, and Salona on the Adriatic Sea, right? And the apex of this offensive was the siege of Constantinople under the Avars 626. So this tells an interesting story, because it's not just a matter of a concerted military effort, but it's probably the spread of peoples all around, right? Which surely had to do in part with the relative support that even the local population enjoyed by a certain degree, right? The elites, after all, ruled from the cities. The countryside was already different in centuries and historically. So let's not underestimate in the other campaigns, as we were saying before, and in the Slavic settlement, some kind of, let's say, support from the Balkan, the pre-existing Balkan people, to, in fact, this kind of unhinging from the harsh Constantinopolitan rule that was, pretty heavy in taxes, etc. This was happening elsewhere. Think about the Longobards in Italy. We made so many videos about that, saying probably that people fled into the Longobards territories to avoid paying Byzantine taxes. So I get the impression that this was kind of the same in the Balkans, in this major moment of crisis of late antiquity, and so the shift of some power dynamics, at least. Now, when the Slavs and later the Avars enter the Balkans, they seemed also to have not enjoyed the same degree of technical military capacities that they proved to have later. In part, this is due to the fact that especially the Avars hadn't politically coalesced into the Khaganate as a unitary power yet at the beginning. So there were kind of sparser raids from waged by some oligarchs that were kind of out there on their own. Naturally, after that, the Avars showed a dramatic logistical capacity that is not entirely due to just the properly the know-how that had gathered having fought against the Romans, right? But probably also with some pre-gressed, especially Middle Eastern siege warfare influence that they had collected in the steppes by Sasanian influence for sure during their migration towards Europe. This aspect is very overlooked. We find the same obsidianal capacities among the Magyars 3 centuries later, and in fact across the Danube. It was also, as you know, the lower Danube was essentially a branch of the Silk Road, one of the westernmost branches of the Silk Road. They were intense through the Black Sea and the Caucasus, the Caspian, contacts with the Middle East, right? And probably was a lot of support at that point that, in fact, the Persians, in coordination of the Avars, were given, even through that corridor, to pressure the Roman Empire. So again, it's like maybe a cosmic clash, let's say, of light and darkness in this dualistic struggle for the ecumenic control. But it's interesting that the Slavs kind of fit into this, and we can expect naturally that the Slavic leaders having mutuated an important amount of this know-how in practice, right? They had their heavily armored mounted elites, they had some siege capability. They just do not look so stereotypically like that, because yes, they were less advanced, they were poorer, right? At some point, I don't know, the Longobards had to send shipbuilders from Italy to the Bulgarian emperor, because in order to besiege Constantinople from sea. So the Balkans needed know-how, technology, advisors, etc., from other kind of more advanced areas, but they still were just next door to Constantinople. They knew what, in fact, they needed to cope with them, right? So again, the Slavs are mostly on the lower end of this. They were the ones, as we'll see now, that settled mostly in the most impervious areas with less resources, but they compensated lack of that with determination, with some also arguably also more hardcore military values, spiritual sense than other peoples that, yes, were growing powerful at a point, but also softening up like the others, that by the end of the 8th century would be wiped out by the Carolingians, as if, nothing had been of that empire. Well, nobody really dislodged the Slavs from where they were. It doesn't matter how politically, inept they were. In fact, there are some considerations about this. Coder wrote that the democratia, which is what Procopius describes the Slavic social and political organization was like in a tribal community ruled by the council of the nobles, would have impeded a coordinated military resistance against the enemy. And so putting them in this situation of being under foreign political leadership. Well, this is kind of obvious, but this is not because of the Slavs or their relatively egalitarian model. All peoples at the time had this kind of tribal/clanic ideal that everybody was a freeman if they were able to bear arms. So if they were able, right, this was the universal military religious creed of the time, right? If you were able to exist, right, as a free people, it's because there was something divine in it, and so this freedom had to be preserved. And this was true for ecumenic empires that subjugated other peoples, and the smaller ones that in their tiny way were trying to do exactly the same, and that really didn't have anything to envy in terms of viciousness and exterminations and raping and killing compared to the greater powers, right? This was the universal standards of the time, and so there is really nothing to do with that. Of course, there is Christianization in the process. We will talk a bit about that later, because this is an interesting aspect, in fact, of the Slavic migrations, that they came to settle, in fact, in areas that not just had been Christianized early on, but in a sense that were repaganized because the local structures had kind of collapsed in part, and so they lived always in a kind of a limbo state between, in fact, it's different creeds, and they have interesting superimpositions also that are still alive in today's folklore and etc. I mean, the same way they would see their leaders like, right? You see, all their names leaders is whatever Slav, right? So glory, like no other people has that degree of primitive uniformity in the religious military obsession of the universal creed like Slavs had, right? And in part, naturally, because they had to compensate ideologically because what they could not really achieve in terms of greater power. But in that sense, as we were saying before, providing them with that resilience that other peoples, like more developed, kind of had more difficulty to keep together. And so the settlement is interesting naturally because they found some pre-existing administration structures that surely assimilated, were kind of civilized in the process. Think about the Byzantine military administrative system in the Danubian provinces that, as we've seen, also were pretty much militarized properly, so they probably comforted that kind of settlement as much as was functionalized for at least preparing some military response of sort. But as we were saying before as well, these areas were really not favored by that because war was always waged around, so it more molded the people than the infrastructures that were hopelessly decaying by this period. And it's thought that, in fact, the mobility of these peoples was always evident, right? They would settle somewhere, but it was not necessarily for good. Somewhere it happened, somewhere not. It's said that they normally settled among the natives by the end of the season, so in autumn, when the winter supplies were secured for the people and the chattel, they found disastered realities, not just because of the massacres, but also, as we've seen, because of the demographic and economic decline. This actually favored integration because they didn't find much of a cultural resistance anymore. As we were saying before, probably this favored not just the settlement, but also the properly the political expansion of these groups, because the local populace was exhausted. They didn't properly, anybody who could bring stability, even just temporarily, without requiring them to fight, even being initially in a kind of subservient position, would be welcome. But the truth is also probably that from a social point of view, the divide was null, right? Because nobody had anything. It was the standard situation. And again, it's really important, in my opinion, from a historical point of view, to stress the harshness of this moment in early medieval times, especially in the Balkans, right, in that frontier, because that were a lot of warfare. We are not, again, as we were saying at the beginning, not so overly documented on it, but we see just war, and war. And that is terrifying, right? So this is where the Slavic, properly the Slavization occurred, where Slavic groups settled. So, speaking of the pre-existing Roman provinces, looking from the northwest, you have Noricum. Here it's not exactly the Balkans, but looking at this crescent that in part starts from there with the Slavs settling in the Eastern Alps, for example, with the Carantanians. With the Pannonians was properly a Slavic duchy, with the Pannonian Dulebs. Dalmatia was settled by the White Croats and the Guduscani. The Serbs, Narentines, the Zaclumians, the Travunians, the Canalides, while the area of Prevalitana that was there between the sea and the interland, in fact, the Oaklands. The provinces of Mesia and Dardania in the continental part were inhabited by the Mereani, the Branichevsi, the Timotsani, and the Predenecenti. The province of Dacia Ripensis, so not the older Dacia that was from the other side, but what had been in fact brought across the river administratively with the name, together with Mesia Secunda, was inhabited by the so-called, in fact, here we are toward the eastern part, by the so-called seven Slavic tribes, and the Severians. This would be importantly involved actually in the formation of the first Bulgarian Empire, together with the Bulgars at the end of the 7th century. Also, part of the diocese of Thrace was settled by the Smoliani and the Strimonites, and also the whole diocese of Macedonia, that actually arrived up to, in fact, the south of Greece, was settled by a consistent amount of tribes named, if you do not know the names of some of them, the Drugubitai, the Berziti, the Sagudatas, the Runkinoi. These are naturally also kind of Hellenized names, Byzantine source. But Bayunitai, Belegizitas, Melingoi, and Edzeritai. And as we were saying at the beginning, there were some Slavs crossing in Anatolia or even being deported there. This would occur again later on, also with after the first Bulgarian Empire was crushed. Also, the Ottomans later on would do. And in fact, you see, like also in Turkey, how many people actually look pretty much Slavic, and that's part of the reason. And as we were hinting at before, there was also a kind of repaganization by a certain degree of the Balkans that regressed to sort of kind of more tribal state. It was more functional to that order of ideas. While, of course, the trend of Europe was going towards Christianization on the long run. I made a video recently about the Christianization of Great Moravia and that case actually also of Khazaria, but still talking about the relation of Constantinople also with the Serbs, the Bulgarians in the process. And during the 7th and the 8th century, as you know, there was a major contraction of especially the Byzantine imperial force. That is, aside from the generalized intercontinental crisis, the Byzantines suffered a major territorial loss, especially at the hands of the Muslims. that basically, yeah, we're talking about half of the empire, right? So this means that the deterrent that the empire enjoyed to be properly an ecumenic power and exercising power of control on the Balkans as well decreased, not just by half, but by more. Right? There's all a process of decentralization, administratively, the enforcements of the themes of this kind of reliance, in fact, of local resources, and this favors the Slavization of the Balkans further, right? Because kind of everybody was kind of out there on their own. So in a way, many Slavs didn't have many other options themselves but to, if they didn't have much political autonomy as single clans, etc., to join the, at least to obey partially the Byzantine administration. In any case, Constantinople was growing far as a world, way more than it had been before, but in the time of Justinian were far away in that regard. The Slavs were settled, as we've seen, in Pannonia and Dalmatia, and it's, in fact, at the beginning of the 7th century under Heraclius, as we've seen, the Croats and the Serbs from Central Europe are essentially either invited or just descending on their own, also probably in a kind of anti-Avar fashion in imperial territory. These peoples are the ones that would dwell mostly in the highlands, historically, right? If you look at the Serbians, for example, like compared to the modern countries, more in the lowland. But the Serbians were originally probably mountaineers and kind of maintaining that kind of ferocious kind of up to the Adriatic. Those areas are also basically the mountains arrive to the sea. Because they were under the pressure from the Pannonian side, from the flatlands, of the Avars. And so at that point they were just siding with the Byzantines more in the balance because kind of the closest enemy, the most ferocious one, the most dangerous one was the Avar one. Whereas, as we've seen, the Byzantines were actually struggling for their own existence. They didn't have much to, they had much better things to do than knocking at the Croat or the Serbian doors. So these peoples kind of, sympathized more with imperial cause at that point. And also because of the interests of their own elites. So also the process of Christianization that favored the political compaction. Well, the Croats actually converted to Roman Catholic. The schism didn't exist yet. They connected with the Pope, whereas the Serbs were. In fact, today the modern countries are respectively Catholic and Orthodox, because the Serbians fell more, in fact, in the were from the other side. They were more continental, whereas the Croats more Adriatic in a way. Because they still stretched across the Dinaric Alps. Now, so there was also an important Frankish influence in the area, especially after the Avars were crushed by Charlemagne at the end of the 8th century. As we've seen recently with the video of the Duchy of Croatia, Croatia fell under essentially a Frankish vassal and kept remaining more or less in the orbit there. So that's why the papal connection in part. Whereas even though they kept fighting for their own autonomy also from the Franks. The same goes for the Pannonian Slavs until the arrival of the Magyars, that instead changed a lot of things again in the area, like the Avars had done. The Bulgarian Empire was growing essentially as the greatest power in the area, also encompassing, namely, at least the Carpathian Basin, arriving up to Great Moravia. It also had at some point arrived up to the Danube, up to Belgrade, and so this floating Central European powers that kind of, Moravia kind of, the Great Moravia evaporated after a while, but that still were pushing still the Sclavinians in the west, still cautiously in the mountain, entrenching further in the mountains. The Slavs essentially in the south, from the Mediterranean watershed in the Aegean, were instead surrounded usually by at least a Greek-speaking majority, whatever the original ethnic origin of these peoples were historically, Thracians, Illyrians, or same Hellenic, etc. Also, the Albanian speaking, so they would be absorbed by there. So in the area of Epirus, in the course of the Middle Ages, the Albanian kind of identity would have emerged later on. So these are more or less the boundaries. And to see the thing in a more archaeological dimension, at least, we see essentially a spread of the Slavs unavoidably across the major orographic channels delimited by the mountain ranges, right, that mostly run from north to south in the Balkans. And we see a big deal, of course, of Byzantine influence. The southern you go, this is obvious. That was a world of civilization, was a sedentary one that kind of more impressive in the first place in a cultural sense. And so the Slavs were naturally and greatly influenced. I mean, if you look at their art even still, and with the Christianization, and they are Byzantines in court, let's say, in from a cultural point of view, artistically, etc. And that's an important divide. Also, you see the different sphere of influences of Constantinople and Rome in this ways. But there is always an interesting hybrid in the process. We see some cultural areas archaeologically that are kind of famous. Essentially, you have the hypothestic candestive one that would roughly correspond to the area of the First Bulgarian Empire. The Antes would have been in the immediately in the north of that, across the Dniester River, with the Penkovka culture. Then there is Prague in the from the northwest, that is divided, is distanced by the hypothestic candestive one by the hours. So more or less, these were the original kind of. Yes, in kind of on the between the Vistula and the Sudetes, it was the Mogila one. Between the Pripyat and the Dniester, there is the Korchak. The more north were also the Sukhov, the Kolochyn, but those are more or less the Slavic material cultures that overlap with probably, in fact, groups that were forming at the time. In the Prague one would correspond roughly to one of Great Moravia. Etc. These are just names. The locations they stretch, and the majority of the Slavs in the Balkans and Peloponnese were on the base of this appreciations, especially the link with the Penkovka culture and other elements, bring to think that most of the Slavs were descending from the Ante. Right, so in that area of today's Ukraine, and we see from their archaeology, of course, they were mostly about agriculture. They cultivated proso millet that they introduced. They also cultivated wheat, flax. They learned viticulture that in the Central Eastern world didn't quite exist. Instead, in the Roman, the boundaries of the Roman Empire was the one of the wine. In many ways, they naturally also grew other fruits and vegetables. They collected other fruits. They were importantly about also animal husbandry. They rose ox and goats, and they had an important usage of horses for war and agriculture at the same time. As we've seen, the Balkans are heavily mountainous, most areas, so the people living in the hilly terrain were mostly shepherds, right? This also informed kind of partly their lifestyle compared to the ones living in the valleys. There was a lot of transhumance, and that's what has attracted a lot of interest also by the ethnologists, because in trying to explain the Romance survival in Romania, for example, how that did happen, right, in kind of more Slavic, a Slavic area, that with also other important ethnic, like Germanic, Turkic influxes and so on over the centuries. and naturally they fished. There are a lot of lakes and rivers in the area, and in fact the Strategicon recalls their important amphibious capacities that are connected properly also on the, not just on the strategic necessity, but in part refer also properly on the area of settlement, especially the Antes, that were kind of amphibious on the Black Sea, across the Dniester River, the marshes of the Danube, right? So those had learned how to also to defend, to entrench themselves. Like it was the same Bulgars did it in the area when they initially tried to defend themselves from the Byzantine attempt to wipe them out. Genetically, there is a correspondence between, in fact, the Balkan, let's say, Slavic speakers background and the, let's say, a migration era movement, let's say, that brought for their ancestors to settle there. And so more or less these macro indicators do match, right? And the Slavic migrations in this sense are dated to something between 500 900 AD in the area, in part also later. And this Slavic influence is seen in 40-50% among the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Hungarians, right? So areas that, as you understand, are not necessarily even just Slavic in a total identity. The Bulgarians bore the name of a non-Slavic people, but they are Slavic people. The Romanians are, at least they speak a Romance language, but also have this massive Slavic thing. The Hungarians speak an Ugro-Finnic language, but they're also pretty heavily Slavic in their cultural background. Also, naturally, the Southern Slavs have much more in common with the Greeks than the East Slavs or the West Slavs. There is this important Balto-Slavic nature, especially of the, let's say in general, of the South Slavs in part. I mean, there is seemingly, I don't know where this is exactly derived from with certainty, but that speaks of some broader contact also with more northern influence. By the way, the area was invested by lots of other peoples historically, even probably during the Viking era. You would be surprised how many. Also through the same Byzantine Empire, we made a video about the Varangians, explaining that we just have this meme, a video game, ridiculous culture about the Varangians, like the guys with double-handed axe. But actually, they were kind of an entire army, right, with lighter troops, etc., were settled in the Balkans, and there are striking, in fact, Nordic traces, especially in areas like Serbia, etc., that may have actually also come through sort of kind of a Kievan channel at that point. It's something we have to see in, especially in a bit about Serbian military culture in medieval times. As we were saying in the beginning, also a very, a minority yet relevant trace of Slavic ancestry is found among the Peloponnesian people, and the general connection, however, of the places of origin with the places of origins of the Slavs seem to point for the ones who settle in the Balkans with the original areas that brought to the medieval Slavic expansion, mostly from present days Ukraine and southeastern Poland. Alright, so for today, stop it here, but we will keep talking about medieval Slavs. There is a new playlist I created containing all the videos I made on them, Slavic history. Then there is otherwise medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe, and every nation kind of has its medieval playlist dedicated, and we will keep talking about that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.